In the spring of 1834, as the first dogwood blossoms began to paint the Virginia hillsides, a discovery was made in the quiet, rolling farmlands of Henry County that would forever scar the American conscience and redefine our understanding of human evil. It was a revelation so profound, so horrifying in its implications, that it would ripple through time, challenging the very notion of safety and community in the young nation. 47 children, their ages ranging from mere 6 years to a world-weary 16, were found imprisoned in a labyrinthine basement beneath what appeared to the world to be a perfectly ordinary farmhouse. These children, a tragic mosaic of stolen lives, bore no familial resemblance, whispered in a cacophony of different languages and dialects, and when questioned by their trembling rescuers, could only utter one name through their cracked lips and tear-streaked faces: Mother Sullivan. The official sheriff's report, deliberately buried for over a century in the dusty depths of the Henry County archives, described scenes of such profound disturbance that 3 of the investigating officers resigned from duty within a week, their spirits broken by what they had witnessed. Yet, what makes the Sullivan case truly haunting isn't just the visceral horror of what was found in that dank, subterranean prison on that April day. It is the chilling, slow-dawning realization that Constance Sullivan, a woman known to her neighbors as a pious and charitable soul, had been operating her twisted enterprise for over 2 decades, hidden in plain sight, a predator masked in the respectable gown of a benevolent matron. The children called her mother. But the truth behind that title would prove to be a perversion of love and care, a truth far more sinister than any in the community could have ever imagined. The Virginia of 1834 was a land caught violently between 2 worlds. The old entrenched plantation system, built on the brutal foundation of slavery, still dominated the social and economic landscape south of the James River. Yet, drifting down from the north, were the whispers of industrial change, of railroads and mechanization, a new world slowly encroaching on the old. In this environment of transition and tension, the small farming community of Millbrook existed as a microcosm of rural America, a collection of perhaps 50 families spread across the gentle, fertile slopes of Henry County. Millbrook was the picture of antebellum pastoral life. Most residents were smallholders farming tobacco or corn, their lives dictated by the seasons and the sun. They traded goods and gossip at Henderson's General Store, the social hub of the county, and gathered for socials, church suppers, and town meetings in the one-room schoolhouse that served as the community's heart. It was a place where doors were rarely locked, not out of naivety, but out of a deeply ingrained belief in a shared identity and mutual trust. The Sullivan property sat on the outskirts of this community, a modest but well-kept 2-story wooden farmhouse surrounded by nearly 200 acres of prime agricultural land. To any traveler passing along the dusty, rutted road that connected Millbrook to Richmond, the Sullivan farm appeared utterly unremarkable, even prosperous. The house itself, built in the Federal style popular during the 1810s, featured crisp, white-painted clapboard siding and a wide, welcoming wraparound porch. A sturdy red barn stood 60 yards behind the house, with a chicken coop and a brick smokehouse completing the picture of a typical, successful farmstead layout. But what made the Sullivan property unique, what housed its terrible secret, wasn't visible from the road. Ezra Sullivan, a man of few words and a grim demeanor, had purchased the land in 1809 with money inherited from his father's lucrative tobacco fortune. He was a competent farmer but a solitary figure, more comfortable with the company of his tools and livestock than with his neighbors. Shortly after acquiring the property, he began a project that would become his life's work, the expansion of the house's basement. While most Virginia homes of the period featured simple, shallow root cellars for storing preserves and vegetables, the Sullivan basement was something else entirely. It began to extend year by year, far beyond the footprint of the house above, digging deeper into the Virginia clay. Local craftsmen, stonemasons, carpenters, blacksmiths, remembered being hired for various discrete excavation and construction projects throughout the 1810s and 1820s. Ezra paid well, always in cash, but his instructions were peculiar and strict. Each worker was assigned a specific, isolated task, reinforcing a wall here, installing a ventilation shaft there, forging a set of heavy iron rings. He asked only that they focus on their assigned section, never questioning the overall design or purpose. No single craftsman ever saw the completed, horrifying whole. They left with coin in their pockets and a vague unease they quickly dismissed. In 1811, Ezra brought home a bride. Constance Sullivan arrived in Millbrook at the age of 22, and from the beginning she cultivated an image of fragile respectability. Neighbors remembered her as a handsome woman, not beautiful, but with a striking presence. Severe dark hair often tucked neatly under a bonnet, sharp features, and an unusually soft, almost whispering voice that commanded attention. She dressed simply but impeccably in plain, dark dresses, attended Methodist church services when her poor health permitted, and quickly established a reputation for charitable works and pious conversation. When approached about contributing to community causes, a new church roof, aid for a struggling family, Constance would inevitably demur, explaining with a sigh that she and Ezra were already stretching their resources to care for several orphaned children from her family back in Pennsylvania. It was a temporary arrangement, she assured them, a Christian duty, just until suitable permanent homes could be found through her extensive correspondence with relatives up north. This explanation became her shield. It perfectly satisfied the community's flickering curiosity about the occasional fleeting glimpses of children around the Sullivan property. Mrs. Agnes Henderson, behind the counter of the general store, would sometimes see a pale young face peering nervously from the back of the Sullivan wagon when Constance came to town for supplies. The children never spoke, never waved. Constance would gently chide them for their shyness, explaining to Agnes that they were terribly traumatized by the loss of their parents and needed time, peace, and quiet to adjust to their new circumstances. The community, all too familiar with the high mortality rates and tragic frequency of orphaned children, accepted these explanations without a second thought. Their compassion became the very tool used to blind them. Thomas Henderson, who ran the store with his wife, later testified that Constance Sullivan was one of his most reliable and organized customers. Every 2 weeks, like clockwork, she would arrive with a detailed, precisely written list and enough cash to purchase substantial quantities of basic foodstuffs, barrels of flour and cornmeal, sides of salt pork, jugs of molasses, sacks of beans. The quantities seemed enormous for a childless couple, but when Thomas once gingerly mentioned it, Constance fixed him with her placid gaze and reminded him of the poor, hungry mouths she was feeding. She also purchased unusual amounts of basic medicines, laudanum, ipecac, bitter tonics, explaining that children from wretched circumstances often arrived riddled with ailments that required diligent treatment. Her knowledge of these ailments and their remedies was, according to the traveling physician Dr. Marcus Whitfield, unnervingly specific. He was called to the farm a handful of times over the years, but was never allowed to see a patient. Constance would describe symptoms with clinical precision and demand specific drugs. When he insisted on examining the child, she would become a fortress of maternal protection, claiming the children were terrified of men, that his presence would cause a regression. Dr. Whitfield, bound by the era's conventions, would reluctantly comply, leaving with a growing, unshakable disquiet. The rhythm of the Sullivan farm itself operated on a schedule that subtly set it apart from its neighbors. While other farming families rose with the sun and retired at dusk, life at the Sullivan property often hummed with activity well into the night. Lamplight could be seen flickering in the farmhouse windows at odd hours, and the sound of distant hammering, sawing, or the scrape of something heavy being moved would sometimes echo eerily across the still fields long after midnight. When asked about these nocturnal labors, Ezra would grumble about making improvements to better accommodate the growing number of children in their care. The deception was so comprehensive that even the local pastor, Reverend Samuel Matthews, was utterly convinced. During his occasional pastoral visits, he would praise the Sullivans for their Christian compassion. He offered to help find homes for the orphans. Constance would have an answer ready. She was in deep correspondence with her family in Pennsylvania. The process was delicate. Reverend Matthews would ride away, his faith in his flock reaffirmed, completely unaware. The bitter winter of 1834 provided the first cracks in the facade. It was a season of unprecedented cold, and the freeze that gripped Virginia seeped into the stones of the Sullivan basement, intensifying the misery of its inhabitants and creating the circumstances for discovery. The first crack appeared on February 23rd. A traveling merchant named Jacob Stern, caught in a violent snowstorm, was forced to seek shelter at the Sullivan farm. Ezra answered with clear reluctance, but the code of hospitality in such weather was absolute. Stern's evening was marked by palpable tension. The Sullivans were nervous, jumpy. When he asked after the famous children, Constance insisted they were all ill with fever and asleep. Throughout the night, lying on a parlor cot, Stern heard it, a low, constant, muffled crying from beneath the floorboards. Ezra dismissed it the next morning as wind in the foundations. Stern left, but the memory of the sound and the family's strange anxiety stayed with him. The second crack came 3 weeks later. Mary Catherine Flynn, a 14-year-old Irish immigrant, became separated from her family during a river crossing. Cold, lost, and desperate, she stumbled upon the Sullivan farm as darkness fell. Constance took her in. Mary Catherine was never seen again. When her family reported her missing, a search party found nothing. She was presumed another victim of the wilderness. Her disappearance a tragic but unremarkable event in a harsh time. The final, shattering crack came on April 2nd. A local farmer, William Hutchinson, was hunting rabbits in the woods bordering the Sullivan land when he heard a sound that froze his blood. It was not the sound of children at play. It was raw, desperate screaming, the sound of pure terror, and it seemed to be coming from underground, from beneath the Sullivan house itself. Creeping closer, he watched for nearly an hour. The screams continued. Then he saw it. Ezra Sullivan emerged from a heavy cellar door on the side of the house, looked around furtively, and disappeared back inside, locking it behind him. Hutchinson took his story to his neighbors. Some dismissed it, suggesting the orphaned children were troubled and required harsh discipline. But others began to voice their own suppressed doubts. The massive food purchases, the strange noises, the fact that no one had ever actually spoken to one of these children. Reluctantly, Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, a veteran lawman, agreed to investigate. On the morning of April 8, 1834, Sheriff Crawford and his deputy, Marcus Webb, rode out to the Sullivan farm. Constance met them at the door with her customary calm grace. She invited them in for coffee, expressed sadness over the wicked gossip, and launched into her well-rehearsed explanation. She showed them letters from Pennsylvania and promised the children could meet them once their illness passed. Everything was perfectly reasonable, until Deputy Webb asked to use the privy. Walking around the side of the house, he saw it, the cellar door William Hutchinson had described. But it was no ordinary door. It was fortified with 3 heavy padlocks and wrapped in chains. The wood around the locks was gouged and splintered, as if clawed at by desperate fingers. Webb returned and quietly informed the sheriff. Crawford, his demeanor now formal, asked to see the cellar. The change in Constance Sullivan was instantaneous and terrifying. Her face drained of color. Her hands trembled. She began to stammer, her soft voice rising in pitch. The cellar was unsafe, full of old equipment. The children weren't allowed down there. There was nothing to see. And then they heard it. A muffled, weak cry for help. Unmistakable. It was coming from directly beneath their feet. What followed would haunt the men for the rest of their days. Forcing the locks, they opened the door. A wave of putrid air struck them, a thick miasma of unwashed bodies, human waste, sickness, and despair. The basement was a vast, stone-walled dungeon extending far under the fields. In the dim light filtering through grates, they saw them, children, dozens of them, chained by their ankles to iron rings mortared into the walls. They were emaciated, dressed in rags, their skin marked with sores and old bruises. The silence after that initial cry was worse than the screaming would have been. They simply stared at the lawmen with hollow, empty eyes, beyond hope, beyond even curiosity. Deputy Webb, a father of 4, vomited twice. Sheriff Crawford, a hardened man, felt the world tilt on its axis. This was beyond any crime he could conceive. They found punishment devices, a crude medical area, and in a side chamber, detailed ledgers. The records listed names, dates of arrival, and notes on each child's condition. Over 90 children had passed through this hell. The final horror awaited in a narrow, crawling passage. There, in shallow pits covered in lime, were the remains of those who had not survived. At least 36 souls. Some small skeletons showed signs of violence. The question of what happened to the others was answered in the most horrifying way possible. The investigation that exploded from that basement revealed an operation of terrifying sophistication. Constance's ledgers were a roadmap to a multi-state criminal network. Coded correspondence showed she was in contact with at least 12 other individuals across 5 states. Letters discussed merchandise, quality, and shipments. One, from a Morrison in Philadelphia, described 6 new items of varying ages and conditions, complete with notes on which were compliant. Financially, the operation was vast. Constance had been paying between $50 and $200 per child. She had also been receiving payments, acting as both a destination and a distribution point. Over $8,000 had flowed through her hands, a fortune. The surviving children slowly and painfully began to tell their stories. They spoke of being broken through isolation, punishment, and psychological manipulation. Constance convinced them they were worthless, abandoned, that the outside world was even more dangerous. They described a hierarchy among the prisoners, with older children given privileges for enforcing control. The investigation uncovered her sources: corrupt officials at poorhouses and orphanages who sold children, and criminal contacts in cities who identified the most vulnerable: runaways, street urchins, children no one would miss. The breakthrough came from a 14-year-old girl named Rebecca, who had been held since 1829. Unlike the others, she had never broken. She remembered everything. Most importantly, she described a visit from a well-dressed man from Charleston, South Carolina, just weeks before the raid. He had inspected her and others like livestock, complaining they were too damaged. He left a letter signed H. Blackwood. This led investigators to Henry Blackwood, a wealthy plantation owner. He wasn't buying children for field labor. He was using them for something far more sinister. His plantation had experimental quarters, where he and associates from the Charleston Medical College conducted horrific medical experiments, testing human endurance, diseases, and toxins. They were laboratory animals. Records showed Blackwood had purchased at least 37 children from the network. Only 4 had survived. As the scope of the conspiracy became clear, powerful forces pushed back. Sheriff Crawford received death threats. Deputy Webb was ambushed and beaten. Dr. Whitfield's practice was boycotted. A key witness, a boy named Timothy, vanished from protective custody. The pressure climaxed when Constance Sullivan was found dead in her cell, officially a suicide just before she was to testify fully. Few believed it. Her death protected the network's most powerful clients. Salvation came from an unexpected source: Samuel Pierce, a guilt-ridden former overseer for Henry Blackwood. His testimony to a federal grand jury was devastating. He described the demonstrations Blackwood held for potential buyers, where children were showcased and examined like cattle. He provided the ledgers that detailed the torture and deaths of dozens of children. His evidence allowed federal marshals to coordinate raids across the South, rescuing over 100 more children and arresting prominent figures, including Blackwood and the physicians. The subsequent legal battles were long and fraught. Wealth and political connections shielded many. Ezra Sullivan was convicted and hanged. Henry Blackwood was convicted but died in prison under suspicious circumstances before his execution. Others fled to Europe or escaped meaningful punishment entirely. The Sullivan case left a deep and permanent scar. The 47 survivors faced lifelong physical and psychological scars. Rebecca, after her brave testimony, lived a quiet life with a Quaker family in Pennsylvania, never speaking publicly of her ordeal again. The Sullivan farm was razed, the basement filled with concrete. A small cemetery for the unknown children was established on the site, but the case's impact was profound. It catalyzed the first federal laws against child trafficking and abuse. It led to sweeping reforms in orphanage oversight and the establishment of modern child welfare protections. It created new legal precedents for interstate criminal investigation.